Support for this podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We take a closer look at our human experiences and use stories to explore culture, history, and contemporary issues. You can find us on thinkwhy.org.
I think it's something like 1 in 5 teenage girls experiences some kind of relationship abuse before she's 18.
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This is What's Your Why? Each week we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn. What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities? Serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. Welcome to What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Reverend Sally MacNichol. She is co-executive director of Connect, a New York City nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing interpersonal violence and promoting gender justice. Welcome, Sally.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
When we start our discussion, I first want you to give me a definition of what is interpersonal violence and what does it mean to promote gender justice.
Okay. So interpersonal violence is the actual or threatened physical, sexual, psychological, and that includes emotional, verbal, and spiritual and economic abuse that impairs the ability of the abused person to function in a self-determining way, in a healthy way, or causes the person to be afraid. It is a pattern of coercive control, the goal of which is to maintain power and control. And that's important because we often think of interpersonal violence as just physical, and we think of it as kind of an event where someone gets hit. But it's much, much, much more than that. And when you focus it on power and control and you see that there are all these complicated tactics that people use to control another person, and that they're invisible to many of us when you're controlling someone emotionally or using verbal abuse, and you only do it in places where people don't see you doing it.
And that includes domestic violence.
And that includes domestic violence. This is relationship violence we're talking about. Interpersonal violence is relationship violence. That can include elders, straight people, gay people, trans people, teen dating violence, a huge problem in this country, all, across the spectrum. Unfortunately, it's an epidemic.
Teen dating violence?
Yeah. All of this is an epidemic, from the beginning to the end. But teen dating violence is really happening everywhere. And
what's causing that, do you think? I think what's causing it, maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but how did they determine that it's an epidemic?
Just by the numbers of the reporting that's going on there. I think it's something like 1 in 5 teenage girls experiences some kind of relationship abuse before she's 18. It also, as part of the same definition, emotional, verbal, and psychological, and physical, sexual assault and sexual harassment. I'm from New York City, and we work in the schools there. And some of the ideas about gender roles are surprisingly, some of my colleagues who work directly in the schools say, it's like the 1950s. In terms of gender roles and gender understandings and what the girls feel they must do and what the boys feel they must do to prove their masculinity and their manhood to other boys. And a lot of it is about abusive behavior.
So is that part of your work when you say promoting gender justice?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Gender justice is us living in a world where boys and girls and men and women and everybody, because sometimes we get a little bit just men and women, and there are many people who don't identify either as men or women, and there's trans people. So we, along the whole spectrum, gender justice is a world in which everybody's valued equally and has equal access to resources and help and knowledge and power. And so it's a grand vision, but it's the justice that we need to have across the board. It's about equity.
How did this become your life work and your life passion?
It's an interesting question. Where do you start? Well, I grew up in a family of 3 boys and 2 girls, and a pretty traditional setup. And I became very aware at a young age that there was some imbalance there. And there were things that I couldn't do that my brothers could do. And I was always like a fierce little angry feminist, even though I didn't have that word. But when this particular part of my calling, and I would call it a calling, because it's not anything I ever woke up and said, "Oh, I'm gonna work on ending interpersonal violence and promoting gender justice." But when I was in my early 30s, I went to seminary, Union Theological Seminary in New York, and I one semester took a course called Violence and Violation, and taught by a wonderful theologian named Mary Pellauer, a Christian ethicist, and we just looked in depth at sexual harassment, at rape, at domestic violence, at the intersection of militarism and violence, and I was just overwhelmed, and I just felt completely called to do something. And it was very connected to my faith. I felt that it was just something I wanted to do further. So at seminary, your second year in seminary, you go to work in a church to get your field education, they call it there. And I said, you know what, I'm going to go work in a battered women's shelter. And there was a battered women's shelter that was recently started by a seminary graduate and was actually supported by some churches, gave funds for that seminary. We're talking early 80s right now. So the movement and interpersonal violence, then we called it really the movement, battered women's movement. That language isn't used too much anymore. Was pretty new, and New York City, that's where I was just grappling with this. And I went to work in the shelter, and the very first day that I was there and the very first phone call that I received was from a very angry pastor who had tracked down someone that was in our shelter. I was deeply shaken by that phone call. He was very nasty and spoke about, how dare you, you have no right to split up this family, and sort of almost like every stereotype that you hear about the tension between domestic violence advocates and faith leaders, which I'm very happy to say is really diminished as I'm here in Jackson today. There are a lot of, communities doing good work with, faith communities working with the advocates. But I just was so moved by what I learned in the shelter and what I started to see as something that was pervasive and in our culture. And I never stopped doing it from that point on. And I was also studying liberation theology at that time and feminist liberation theology in particular, and was really starting to see the connections between our belief systems and just the way we understood certain doctrines and what certain practices in the church, how they promoted violence or how they actually transformed violence. And so I just was really interested in that intersection and felt that phone call, I say, was my baptism, my second baptism by fire, that called me into saying, we have to address this issue. And, once you see it, and often we don't see it, but once you start to see it and you begin to see how people's behavior is really abusive. We live in a pretty abusive society. We tolerate a lot of violence. We love violence in many ways. And I am a peace lover. I strive to be a peacemaker and to live a nonviolent life. I'm really committed to that. And I think that really honestly, if we don't make this commitment to changing our relationship to violence, and it really starts in our homes, And we get so much hurt. Children are so hurt by the violence they see in their homes. And intimate violence can really destroy people's lives and take away creativity and spirituality and spiritual power and of women. But certainly some men are abused. And then there are male children who witness this and see their mothers or fathers going through this. And it just needs to be healed. So it's a calling. I never would have expected that this would happen, that 30 years later I would still be working on this. And I've done, it's gone through a lot of different permutations. I've worked in different aspects of it. And now I'm really at a place where preventing it and transforming our consciousness is what I care about.
That was going to be my next question is, how do you transform someone's consciousness if they've been raised one way in, have an attitude or an idea about their masculinity or their femininity? Mm-hmm. How do you raise awareness to what they're doing that maybe should or could be different, and how they treat women, for example?
Okay, let me step back, because I think in order to do that, I do believe that we all have the capacity to change. And I think there are a lot of us, and I think as I, examine myself in the past, I probably went through a time where I thought, some people just can't change. And maybe there's a tiny bit, but I really believe in the capacity that we all have to do something different and to make choices. So that's a starting point, because we can't get stuck in just thinking, oh, that's the way it is. Oh, boys will be boys. Oh, this is just our culture. There are a lot of ways that we normalize the levels of violence that we have. And some of that comes from just feeling like you just can't see any other way of doing it. So that's my starting point. And I think that when you have that belief, people can feel that. It's not easy. I think that there's a lot of education that goes into transformation, transforming consciousness, obviously, and it's a long-term endeavor. It's important to have places where people can come, and at least so far in my experience, what really matters is having places where people can come and talk about what's happened to them and Now, I'm talking about men in general. And we, at Connect, we do a lot of work. I'm co-executive director with a man, and he does a lot of work. We do men's roundtables, and then we have community dialogues between men and women so that everybody can hear each other, because sometimes men aren't aware, as we're seeing, obviously, at this particular moment, we're seeing a lot of men going, well, I didn't know that was bad, or, I can't, just not understanding women's experience. So I think there's an attempt for us to bring people together to hear each other's experience. But when you have a system of dominance of any kind, but of, say, male dominance, you really have to break it down. And I think it's important for people to see, for men, to be able to see the places that they've been harmed by what they've been told is the definition of a man. And we know that, I think Bell Hooks talks about the psychic mutilation of men's emotions and not being free to be who they really are. And the simplistic thing is like men aren't supposed to cry. But if I look at the way men are socialized, I just remember my brother on the football team, and he had a broken rib or something, and they said, no, you have to play. The idea that you have to numb your body, that you aren't supposed to feel pain, that you're supposed to feel tough, and that actually one of the things I found in the work with men who are abusive is that the only emotion they feel that they can have is anger. Trying to get people to see, actually, is there a sadness there? Trying to have other feelings that are not really allowed in the canon of masculinity. Anger is a good thing. Now, we know as women, we're not supposed to be angry. And it's interesting that a lot of men say, well, I have an anger problem, because they don't like to say, I'm abusive. Because anger is a masculine thing to have. The angry man is
So that's acceptable.
That's an acceptable thing. So it's long work, it's education, it's men, and there are many men now who are really looking, and there's a lot of questioning about gender in general, and our LGBTQ communities are questioning what gender really means. It's a good thing that's happening. There's a lot up in the air, and we're going to, I think, re-examine. We're in the process of re-examining and reimagining what it means to be a human being. It's about what it means to be a human being, and we can all be human in our own ways, instead of being in these boxes.
And what is the percentage between men and women that are is it mostly men that are committing domestic violence or interpersonal violence?
Yes. The numbers, there's different numbers, but about 85% of the violence is male to female violence. There's male violence to male violence in same gender loving relationships. There's definitely women that abuse other women and women who abuse men. Everybody does it. We all have the capacity to be abusive and to try to control other people. And, of course, our society is into power and control. What are successful people supposed to be but in control and put me first? And, a lot of the definitions that we have of people who are abusive are strangely, or not so strangely, similar to our definitions of a successful person,
That is interesting.
Yeah, so it's sometimes hard to. Look what's going on right now. We have this Me Too movement, and there's many successful people, and this, that kind of invisibilizes a lot of the other stuff that goes on that, is not celebrity and not Hollywood and not CEO, but you're seeing there people who were very successful, and it didn't matter that this is what they were doing, that people actually supported them in the abuse of other people and felt that was, and that's real and it's pervasive, and people are, shocked that it's so many people, and I believe that that's only like tippy tip of the iceberg,
Well, especially in your work and what you deal with and see all the time.
Yeah, it's just the sexual harassment, just the everyday stuff in terms of being objectified and being seen as less than.
So are they doing more work in the schools with young children to?
Well, I think there's a lot more going on than used to be. In New York, we do work in schools, and the city has a program called the Relationship Abuse Prevention Program, the RAP program, and they train peer leaders, and it's a great program. It should be in all the schools, but the funding is only for a certain amount. But the city is looking into funding more of that, and to also getting it in middle schools, because you really need to start young. Actually, by the time people get into college, they've already formed all these ideas. They've already been shaped in a certain way. There was that incredible article in the Times a couple of days ago about pornography and the effect of pornography on youth's understanding of sex and sexuality, and that's a great article. It's really.
I'm going to read that.
Yeah, I recommend everybody reading that.
And I was going to ask you, is there a book or a couple books that you can recommend that really explains how pervasive it is in our society and in our world, the use of and the acceptance of interpersonal violence?
I'm reading a wonderful book right now, and I love Rebecca Solnit. Do you know her work?
No. Spell her last name.
Solnit.
Okay.
And she has a book called The Mother of All Questions. It's a book of essays, and there's an essay in there called The History of Silence that I recommend that everybody read that. And that whole book is pretty much, the essays are talking about intimate partner violence, interpersonal violence, violence against women. I think it's an excellent book. There are a lot of different books, but I think that's a good one. I like some of Bell Hook's books. She's a Black feminist writer. She has a book called Communion, and another book talking about love that addresses interpersonal violence. These are, essays, and in the faith communities, there's some other kinds of books that are.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to give our audience a place
Yeah,
to,
I'll tell
to
you
go.
what, a place to go, a good place to go is futureswithoutviolence.org.
Okay.
But Futures Without Violence
futureswithoutviolence.org.
is an excellent, it's the National Prevention of Violence program, and we actually did a project with them around restaurant workers. There's no place that the interpersonal violence isn't, you know,
Right.
and we sort
Okay.
of put it in these boxes, but
Right.
really, and we often say that people, you know, working in shelters and domestic violence programs see less violence than anybody, you know, there's more everywhere else that people just don't know how to deal with. But we did a project with them around restaurant workers and training people in restaurants around interpersonal violence and what to do if someone's coming to work and they have violence at home, what's happening if there's sexual harassment between the customer and the waitress, and if you've ever been a waitress, you know what that's like, or between coworkers. And so there are many different places to do the work.
Thank you. It's been so interesting talking to you. I just learned so much. Thanks,
Well,
Ellie.
thank you. Thanks, Emmy.
Thank you for listening. I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This Think Why podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We use the humanities as a lens to explore the human experience. You can find us online at thinkwhy.org.